into the webinar, but thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So thank you for joining us this afternoon for this session that's hosted by AEMO Services. And the focus of today's session is to provide information to assist you to participate in the Tender Round 2 Firming Infrastructure Tender Round. My name is Deborah Palmer and I'm facilitating today's session on behalf of AEMO Services. And we're together today for an hour and a half, so finishing at 1:30 today. And AEMO Services is an independent subsidiary of the Australian Energy Market Operator and is a key partner in the implementation of the New South Wales Government's Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap through its appointment as the New South Wales Customer Trustee. If we could go to the next slide, please. And we acknowledge today that we meet on many different Aboriginal lands, and for me today, that's the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and we show our respect to elders past, present and emerging through thoughtful and collaborative approaches to our work. And I'd just like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us in today's session as well. So before we begin today, I did want to let you know that we are recording today's session and a copy of the recording will be made available on the AEMO Services website following today's session. And this presentation and discussion today is for information purposes only. It's not intended to provide any advice and it's not intended to provide any recommendation or opinion consulting advice as well. So joining me today is Nadia Lieberbrand. She's the Senior Commercial Manager and Nadia has financial, techno-commercial and project development background with more than 15 years experience working as an advisor and commercial director in the energy sector in Africa, Asia and in Australia. Timo Muller is also with us today. He's the Senior Manager Commercial and Timo is a member of the Commercial Leadership Team at AEMO Services. He's in charge of commercial products and agreements, and Timo's worked in several countries and held executive and leadership positions for multiple organisations, including RWE and the World Bank, also as a fast-growing energy startup as well. Ernie Turner, also a Senior Commercial Manager, has been in this area for more than 10 years. He's got experience in financing utility-scale renewable energy projects. Ernie started his career in banking, where he financed infrastructure projects as part of the project finance team. And more recently, Ernie has worked at a utility company and was responsible for organising new business opportunities in the electricity sector. James Heights, Manager of Commercial. James has expertise in energy market design and strategic policy development and has worked previously at the Australian Energy Market Commission and also the Energy Security Board across a range of issues. He's also got experience working in businesses on the transition, specifically with a global leadership in demand participation. Gina Zing is Manager of Commercial. Gina's got 5 years experience working in the industry and has led development of 2 battery projects currently under construction in the NEM. Gina was a Cleo Munro Scholar with the CEC. And finally, Marguerite Petit, who's the Stakeholder Relations Lead of Commercial Engagement at AEMO Services, is also joining us today as part of the team presenting today. So I'd like to hand over in a moment to Nadia. She's going to talk through the purpose of today's session, but I just wanted to let you know that we do have a couple of different opportunities in today's session to ask questions. And if you do have any questions at all, please feel free to feed them through using the Q&A button. That's the 2 speech bubbles at the bottom of your screen. If you pop those in there, we're going to take pauses at 2 different sections in today's session to answer as many questions as we can. So let me hand over now to Nadia, who will talk you through the purpose of today's session. Thanks, Nadia.
Thank you, Deborah. So the purpose of today's discussion is to talk you through our Tender Round 2, which is for firming infrastructure. As Deborah mentioned, AEMO Services has been appointed as a New South Wales Consumer Trustee. A core function of AEMO Services is to run competitive tenders that incentivise new investment in a range of electricity generation, storage and firming infrastructure through the recommendation of long-term energy service agreements to be awarded to projects, as well as access rights in the renewable energy zones. Recently, we published this Tender Round 2 tender guidelines for the firming tender round. And so you can download that on our website to get more information about the eligibility for this tender, as well as the requirements to respond and to participate in the tender. Today, we would like to first of all introduce the tender to you, and we will have a bit of a general session first, just talking through the sort of the general process. Then we will do a deep dive on some key aspects that are, I guess, special to this particular tender, being a firming tender. There are some details that we would like to provide more of a deep dive on to proponents looking to participate, to support you in preparing high quality bids. And we do encourage you to ask questions. The purpose of today is really, you've got the team here, ready to answer any questions that you might have to support you in this process. And we look forward to hearing what your questions are. So maybe going to the next slide. Thank you. So what is this tender about? So the purpose of this tender round 2 is to support the firming infrastructure that is required to bridge a gap in a forecast gap in the energy security target in New South Wales that was published in a recent report by the EST Monitor. And the size of the tender has been set to a minimum of 380 megawatts. And that is that needs to be met by the summer of 25-26. That will be a result of a shortfall in the EST due to the earlier retirement of the Raring power station. So a key part or key function of AEMO services is to act in the long-term financial interests of New South Wales electricity customers. And so this is core of everything we do. And in designing this tender, we did consider the eligibility of different technologies to support this firming capacity that's required. And a key decision that was made was to include demand response in this tender. And we will talk a little bit more about the eligibility of demand response and the way in which demand response projects can participate. The reasoning for that is that we recognized that there is an opportunity for lower cost options or solutions to be bid into this tender round, potentially at lower risk. And we wanted to open it as widely as we could and stimulate competition as well in this tender round. So it's this tender is relevant to a range of these firming technologies and also demand response as well. And I'll hand over now to Ernie, who will talk a bit more about the process.
Thank you, Nadia. So I will cover 4 general topics for the tender today. They are: who can participate in this tender, what are the products available, an overview of the tender process and timetable, and then also an introduction to the merit criteria against which your bid will be assessed. So on the first topic, who can participate? So we are seeking firming infrastructure with flexible capacity in New South Wales. Any firming technology type that AEMO schedules in the central dispatch process is expected to be able to participate in this tender round, provided it meets the eligibility criteria. Examples of such technology include battery storage, thermal storage, gas peaker plants, and loads that are capable of participating in the wholesale demand response mechanism. Project and proponent eligibility criteria are outlined in the tender guidelines. Some of the key project eligibility criteria include projects must have a minimum storage duration or run time of approximately 2 hours. Projects must not be in receipt of government revenue support. However, there are several exclusions which are outlined in the tender guidelines. And another key eligibility criteria is projects must also not be identified as committed or existing by AEMO on or before November 2019. Next slide, please. So there are 2 products available to support the different firming technologies. The draft contracts for these products are made available as part of the tender pack. So there's a demand response LTESA, which covers eligible aggregated loads scheduled through the wholesale demand response mechanism. And then there's the firming supply LTESA, which covers all eligible firming infrastructure except demand response. For example, batteries or gas generators. Both contracts have the same commercial design using an annuity payment structure. Some of the key features of the LTESA include they provide revenue support for up to 10 years through a series of one-year options to receive an annuity payment. The product has been designed to be flexible and support different revenue strategies and also financing structures. Given this tender round aims to contribute to improving system reliability in New South Wales, there are performance requirements that apply to an LTES operator under both the firming supply LTESA and the demand response LTESA. However, these are structured differently to account for the type of firming infrastructure. Next slide, please. So consistent with our tender design, this tender will have two key stages for proponents. The first stage is known as the project bid stage, during which the proponent responds to non-financial value merit criteria, as well as the eligibility criteria. The second stage, which is known as the financial value bid stage, is where invited proponents provide information in relation to the financial value, which is merit criteria 1 and merit criteria 2. The first stage, the project bid stage of the tender, will commence on the 3rd of April, and proponents will have up until May, the 18th of May, to submit their project bid. A project bid will include responses to an online form and attachments to evidence merit of the project, and also returnable schedules. A low scoring project bids against any project merit criteria may not be assessed further and may not be shortlisted for progression to the financial value bid stage. Proponents that are invited to the financial value bid stage, this will occur in June, and then bids will be due in July, and we expect to announce outcomes of the tender in September. Next slide, please. So I will now discuss the 6 non-financial value merit criteria against which your bid will be assessed as part of the project bid stage. You are required to provide quality responses in the online form, supported by attached evidence and returnable schedules, which we will then assess against these 6 non-financial value merit criteria. The tender guidelines provides details about these 6 merit criteria, and I'll just give you a brief overview of them now. So merit criterion 3 assesses the impact of the project on the operation of New South Wales electricity system. Merit criteria 4 assesses the credibility and pathway to reaching commercial operations no later than 1st of December 2025. I do stress the importance of the date 1st of December 2025, which is important in order to meet the energy security target. Example of this merit criterion will include assessment of pathway to financing and relevant development approvals and grid connection. Merit criterion 5 is about the capacity, capability, and track record of the proponent and other relevant entities involved in the project. Merit criterion 6 considers evidence to demonstrate a clear understanding of any impacts that the project has on communities and a tailored approach to minimise and offset any of these impacts. Merit criterion 7 is a demonstration and/or commitments to improve regional economic development, including local supply chain, workforce, and First Nations participation. And merit criterion 8 assesses the extent to which a project contributes to the reduction of Scope 1 emissions of greenhouse gas in the New South Wales electricity sector. For those proponents that participated in Tender 1, merit criterion 8 is a new merit criteria, and we will discuss this in more detail later in the webinar. I will now pass to Timo to discuss the financial value bid stage.
Thank you, Ernie. So the financial value bid stage is the second stage of the tender process. And the outcome of the project bid stage is a project shortlist. So we will invite those projects to submit a financial value bid. And as Ernie mentioned earlier, this is likely to happen in June this year. In the financial value bid stage, we assess the financial value as part of MC1. So as you can see on that slide on the left-hand side, we will look at the benefits of the project that come from two value streams or two sources in that example, or in this case. So one is the impact that the firming infrastructure has on reducing cost to New South Wales electricity customers. And the second benefit is the to what extent the project can improve the reliability of the New South Wales electricity system by reducing unserved energy. So, and against these two benefits, we forecast the cost for New South Wales electricity customers, and the costs are basically determined, or to a large extent determined by your project and by your bid parameters that we're going to talk about later as well. So the sum of benefits and costs will then determine the financial value score. And one of the, like, related to MC1, one of the frequently asked questions we receive is, how do we value firming infrastructure above the minimum duration of 2 hours? And we are going to address that question after the first Q&A part. On the right-hand side, you can see like a very short summary of merit criteria 2, which is commercial departures. So as Nadia and Ernie mentioned earlier, we have published the draft template contracts for the firming LTESA and the project development agreement on our website about a week ago. And we would really appreciate your feedback on these documents, ideally by mid of April, so that we would be able to consider it before we release final contract documents. Important to highlight relating to MC2, that bids that don't request any commercial departures will achieve the highest score in the financial value bid stage in the MC2 assessment. Next slide, please. So thought it may be useful, like there are some new elements in this firming tender to provide you with an overview how it all fits together. It's described in more detail in the tender guidelines, but for the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to start with an introduction of two elements that are highly relevant for this firming infrastructure tender, which are reliability and the energy security target. So additional firming infrastructure provides value to New South Wales electricity customers by contributing to both the reliability standard and the energy security target. So if you look at the left branch of the diagram, it shows the contribution to the reliability standard. A project contributes to the reliability standard by reducing unserved energy. And this value, as previously outlined, is estimated as a benefit in MC1. My colleague James will explore this concept in depth during the second part of today's webinar. Moving now to the right part, or the right branch of that diagram, a project's contribution to the energy security target is measured using EST contribution factors, which are applied to the total merit score. And on the next slide, I'm going to dive into that a bit deeper. So a key factor in assessing the merit of firming infrastructure is its contribution to meeting the energy security target. As Nadia outlined earlier, the breach of the EST and the following direction by the minister is what basically triggered this tender. So in the assessment of projects, we expect to apply the EST contribution factor to the project's total score at the financial value bid stage. So for example, a project that has a score of 80 points and an EST contribution factor of 0.9 will receive an EST adjusted score of 72 points in this example. The level of the EST contribution factor will strongly be driven by the location of the firming infrastructure. So projects that are located within the Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong region will be assessed based on EST contribution factor of 1. So there's no derating happening of the score. The infrastructure is located in the region. There are no losses. So we assume that infrastructure is available and capable of reducing any potential shortfall in capacity. Then the second, like firming infrastructure or firming supply infrastructure that is located outside the SNW region will get assigned a factor below 1. And this factor is calculated based on the project's capability to export energy into this region at the particular time when the EST event or the EST breach was forecast to occur. So the underlying EST event is an evening peak in the summer of 25-26. And in that case, as well as the infrastructure is located outside the SNW region, losses will be taken into account, but they are included in the EST contribution factor. And then a very important point. So an EST contribution factor of 0 means that a project cannot contribute to the EST and is not encouraged to bid in this firming tender round, as it would not contribute to solving the issue that we're trying to solve. But it's important to note this is just for this tender round. This doesn't have any implications for following tender rounds. And we will provide more detail on the EST contribution factor after the first Q&A session. Just to conclude that this first part of the presentation, next slide, please. Very relevant question. What are the attributes of a bid that has high chances of being successful in the tender? So we have summarized a couple of elements here. So first, the bidder would provide a high level of confidence to achieve commercial operations by 1st December 2025. The more evidence the project can provide on its pathway to commercial operations, the higher it will score. Commercial operations by 1st December 2025 would mean that the project would be ready to provide support to the electricity system during the most critical period of the EST horizon. Secondly, a good bid is likely to have a high EST contribution factor, meaning the project is very efficient in reducing the EST gap. Third, it provides attractive financial bid terms. So in particular, a low annuity cap. The annuity cap is the maximum support payment a project can receive from the scheme financial vehicle, and a low net revenue threshold. So then the net revenue threshold is the threshold above which repayments would kick in. Furthermore, all else being equal, the proponent can increase the attractiveness of its bid through offering a short contract term and or a lower contracted percentage. So the contract proponents who have participated in the generation LTESA round and in the ongoing round are familiar with that. It's not a concept we had in the LDS, for example, in the LDS LTESA. So what it does is, or like the contracted percentage is the portion of the project that an LTESA relates to. So for example, a 400 megawatt project can offer a contracted percentage of 50%. So the LTESA would only apply to 200 megawatts of that project. Last but not least, a strong bid is expected to provide significant, actionable and measurable social license commitments. I'm going to hand over to Deb now for our first Q&A session. When we come back, we will conduct a deep dive into some of the key topics that are relevant for bidders. And as previously mentioned, include the EST, the reliability standard, and also the treatment of social license commitments. Over to you, Deb.
Great, thanks Timo, and thanks Ernie and Nadia as well for all of that introductory orientation. I'm going to go to a couple of questions that have come through, but if you'd like to ask any questions throughout the session, please type them into the Q&A button. That's the two speech bubbles down the bottom of the screen. And I'm going to try and get to as many questions as I can in today's session. The questions that we aren't able to get to today, we will be posting responses to a summary of those questions on the AEMO services website following today's session as well. So team, sorry, I think Ernie, probably this question's for you first up. What is the reason for having a maximum contract term of 10 years, which is less than the LDS?
Thanks, Deborah. So, so first, the purpose of this tender is to meet the forecast EST in 2025. And so when we were designing the contract, we considered, we had to consider the types of technologies that would bid into this tender. And so we considered the types of technologies, and our view is that 10 years provides a contract term that de-risks the types of technologies that would bid into this process. And that is the shortest period that we require to de-risk those technologies. We do acknowledge that the technologies that will bid into this process will have life beyond 10 years.
Terrific. Thanks, Ernie. Timo, a question for you. Can LTESA payments for firming infrastructure start before the 1st of December 2025?
So yes, the earliest annuity payments can start is the 1st July 2025. This, like a condition for that to occur, is that the project would have to be operational and the option exercised at least 6 months before the 1st of July 2025.
Terrific, thank you. Timo, I think another question for you here. Can battery assets degrade over the lifetime of the contract, or do they need to maintain the 2-hour duration requirement over the term of the LTESA term?
So that's probably coming from a proponent who's familiar with the LDS LTESA, where there were like very strict requirements, like the project, for example, had always to maintain a duration of at least 8 hours. So that, like for batteries, that would mean that they either had to overbuild or to replace batteries or cells over the term of the LTESA. So for the firming tender, the battery asset can degrade over time below a duration of 2 hours. So very different than the LDS tender. At commercial operations date, the battery must have a duration of approximately at least 2 hours, and proponents must provide a degradation schedule as part of their bid. So that will be then ultimately also go into the firming LTESA contract, and there are incentives in the contract, economic incentives to meet that degradation schedule.
Terrific, thanks, Timo. James, going to get you to jump in on this one. Will demand response and firming supply bids be assessed separately?
No, so all bids will be assessed together as to how we meet the minimum 380 megawatt indicative tender size. Gina will talk about it soon in the deep dive sessions around how DR will be treated somewhat differently in some of the merit criteria, acknowledging the differences between the technologies, but all of the bids will go into a single pool as to how the indicative tender size is met.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Timo, I'm going to come back to you with a question now. Would you favour bids where the full 380 megawatts can be provided by one party providing a portfolio of sites, or by one project?
So we don't have an explicit preference on this. It will really depend on the bids provided. Yeah. So there are arguments like you would assume like one large project can bid like very competitively. Yeah. But having projects in a diversified portfolio, like within that region or like even outside that region, a bit diversified reduces the risk. Yeah. Versus having like if you want like a one large cluster risk, yeah, in that example. So short answer is no, there's no explicit preference, and we will assess projects based on their merits.
Terrific, thank you. Ernie, going to come back to you with a question. What is the required stage for development would be eligible for firming? Is a project very green in development still eligible for firming?
Thanks, Deb. So there's no requirement for a specific stage. The two key eligibility criteria to look at are one in relation to having received SEERs for firming supply infrastructure, and the other one is connection inquiry response. So that they're the two key eligibility criteria that relates to stage of development.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Nadia, question for you. Is COD by the 1st of December 2025 preferred or mandatory? Nadia, I'm not sure if you're on mute.
I think Nadia might be. You go,
yeah, happy to take that one. So it's preferred, and the contract strictly incentivize like a commissioning by that date. Yeah. So if the project is not operational 6 months after the COD date, yeah, like leaving aside any kind of force majeure that would have provided or extended that time frame, this scheme financial vehicle has the option to terminate that contract. And the reason for that is it's really important because that EST gap is in the summer, or is forecast to be in the summer of 2025-26. Yeah. So as mentioned earlier, like we prefer projects that can provide us with a high level of confidence that they will be operational by that date. And Ernie mentioned earlier, yeah, so that plays into financing, that plays into contracts, slots that you may have booked, reserved with EPCs. Yeah, so that will be a key criterion in the assessment.
Terrific, thank you. And sorry, I was slipping into a bit of a lingo there. So when I said COD, I meant commissioning as well, just to clarify that for people. Somebody's also asked if a copy of the webinar recording can be made available, and yes, it can be. It will be made available on the AEMO services website following today's session, so look out for that in the next sort of day or so. Ernie, another question for you. Is the 380 megawatt target measured on project size or on Latessa size? E.g., could a 380 megawatt project asking for 100 megawatt Latessa fulfill the total need of the tender?
Thanks, Deb. Yeah, so the target size is 380 megawatts to meet the EST, and so if a project's asking for 100 megawatt Altesa, but it will meet the 380 megawatt EST, then that would meet the requirement.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Ernie. So we've exhausted all the questions that have come through just at the moment. So we might move on to the next set of presentations from the team. And then following this next set of presentations, we will have an opportunity to answer any more questions that are coming in. So please continue to pop those questions into the Q&A, and we'll try and get through as many of them as we can in today's session as well. So I think I'm heading back now to Timo to kick us off again.
Thank you, Deb. Next slide, please. So yeah, we just talked about that. The indicative target tender size is like at least 380 megawatts based on the infrastructure investment report. This number takes into account the EST contribution factor. So that would mean like if the CT awarded projects with an EST contribution factor below 1, the total gross capacity will be above 380. Yeah, notwithstanding the example that was just discussed before on the like project size. Yeah. The important to note, the consumer trustee may also increase the size of the tender during the tender, and the tender guidelines outline the process for this. A change in the tender size could, for instance, be driven by the AEMC's review of the interim reliability standard, if it is then implemented through New South Wales regulations. I'm going to hand over to James now, who's, I think, presenting some very interesting work we have done on the EST contribution factor.
Thanks, Timo. So diving in where Timo left off last time, where he discussed how and when the EST contribution factors will be applied. Now we're going to talk about what are the EST contribution factors. Well, they're a factor that represents the proportion of a project's capacity that is provided to the Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong sub-region during an EST event for those projects that are located outside of the SNW sub-region. So for example, a 150 megawatt firming asset that's connecting in at Wellington 330 kV, and it is able to deliver 142 of its 150 megawatts to Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong. And so its EST contribution factor would be 0.95. And so what we're looking to do with these factors, it allows the consumer trustee to assess that it contracts with sufficient capacity to meet the identified EST shortfall of 380 megawatts, and allows those outside of the sub-region to participate in the tender. Now, having done the indicative EST contribution factor modelling that we've provided in section C of the tender guidelines, we also welcome proponents to submit additional materials to support different EST contribution factors. Now, these contribution factors that are different might be due to the assumptions that were made during the modelling process, and that modelling process is set out in the tender guidelines, and you can see that in Appendix 1A. Additionally, we want proponents to be able to calculate project-specific factors so you can understand what your factor might be throughout the tender process. And so you'll be able to do this throughout the bid when you fill out your bid form, and you can also see section C of the tender guidelines for a bit more information on that. It's really important, as Timo also alluded to before, that these factors represent specific network conditions during an EST event and not a project's connection point quality. And so this is very specific to this firming tender, given that the EST shortfall is in the SNW sub-region. And so we want to be quite clear that these factors are not trying to represent kind of any other event or time other than the EST event. We'll leave EST contribution factors and go into the reliability standard. So Timo also flagged earlier that a key consideration in assessing benefits of a project that a project provides to New South Wales consumers during by being constructed is its contribution to the reliability standard. And this is assessed during the Merit Criteria 1 financial value assessment. Avoiding unserved energy provides positive financial value to New South Wales consumers, And it's this value that typically depends on two factors of a project: its maximum capacity and its storage duration. And so longer duration of dispatch can reduce unserved energy during extended periods of undersupply, and higher project capacity can mitigate more extreme but shorter unserved energy events. And we'll move on to the next slide, where we'll see how this contribution is actually measured. Now, we measure this contribution through avoided unserved energy, and that's calculated using AEMO's 2022 ESO report. Now, we take the value of lost load, which in New South Wales is the value of customer reliability, currently at $46,025 per megawatt hour, and we multiply that by the avoided USC provided by the project. The table on the right shows the value of this avoided USC, and as you can see, going down the rows, the duration, as it increases, there's more value. And as you can see, going across, the greater the project size, the greater the value. Noting that it's the absolute value that increases. It's not necessarily doubled as you go from 1 hour to 2 hours, but it is the absolute value of a bigger project, and longer duration will provide more avoided USC, which is captured in the merit criteria. And so, as Timo said, that's a question we get often, and really wanted to provide that, and welcome any questions on that later. And with that, I'll hand over to Gina to go through the next set of slides.
Thanks, James. So the Electricity Infrastructure Investment Regulation was introduced in 2021, and it includes new requirements regarding offset contributions to Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions in New South Wales. So this plays out in our tender in two distinct ways. The first way is that it has been incorporated as an assessment requirement. So there is a merit criteria 8, in the project bid stage, which is the first stage of assessment, which will assess each bid's contribution to reductions in Scope 1 emissions in the New South Wales electricity sector. More information on this merit criteria can be found in Section 4 of the tender guidelines. The second aspect in which the regulation plays into our tender is the offset obligation in the LTESO contract. So contributions to emission offsets will be a key commercial term in the LTESO, and these offset requirements are subject to the determinations of the regulator being appointed under the EII regulation and will be the New South Wales EPA. An important note here is that battery projects charging from the NEM are not subject to the offsets emissions regime under this regulation. For completeness though, as the compliance aspect of this regulation is distinct from the assessment aspect of the reg, battery projects will still be assessed against merit criteria 8 and will be required to provide information against this MC. You can find more information on the compliance requirement in Section 2 of the tender guidelines. I should also note that these requirements from the regulation are only relevant to the firming tender round. Next slide, please. So we are very committed to enabling proponents to deliver on social license outcomes. And we also recognise that firming infrastructure bids, especially demand response products, have a lower community impact compared to other energy infrastructure projects such as wind and solar. We recognise that opportunities for regional economic development will also vary across technology types. So to that effect, firming LTESs will be required to provide the Community Engagement Plan returnable schedule that is assessed under merit criteria 6, and the Industry and Aboriginal Participation Plan returnable schedule that is assessed under MC7. Those bidding for firming LTESs are advised to tailor their MC6 returnable schedules to offset potential adverse local community impacts, and to tailor their MC7 commitments to the project's technology characteristics. For demand response products, however, they are not required to provide a returnable schedule under merit criteria 6. So that's the Community Engagement Plan. They are, however, required to provide a merit criteria 7 returnable schedule, but they only need to populate table 2, which pertains to employment and workforce. Please note that if a demand response proponent does choose to submit an MC6 returnable schedule and or a fully complete MC7 returnable schedule, they will be assessed favorably. Example returnable schedules are available on our website in the social license pack if you guys would like to familiarize yourselves in preparation for your bids. Next slide, please. So finally, this is a really exciting tender for AEMO services, as it is our first time contracting for demand response products. And it presents an opportunity for AEMO services to lower the cost of demand response for New South Wales customers. We are focused on meeting the New South Wales electricity needs at the lowest cost, and this is why we have included a demand response Altessa product. As a new technology type in our tenders, there are some key items for us to call out. As Altessas are NEM-based products, and with the wholesale demand response mechanism being the only current method for demand response to be scheduled under NEM, eligible demand response bids must be registered or intend to register on the NEM as a wholesale demand response market participant. There have also been a number of adjustments to the tender process to ensure accommodation to demand response products, for example, the way that we assess social license. And it's important to note that demand response products and firming supply products will be assessed against the same merit criteria to form one single shortlist. And I think I'm going to throw it back to you, Deb.
Great, terrific. Thanks, Gina. And thanks to yourself and James and Timo again for those presentations. So there's a few more questions that have come through in the Q&A, and I'll try and work through as many of those as I can, keep them coming as well. I just wanted to note, though, there are a couple of questions that are coming in that relate to specific projects. So the team is unable to respond to those specific project questions in a public webinar. So just wanted to note that we can take sort of general questions. Timo, I'm going to come to you. Can you please explain in more detail the advantage of the low contracted percentage?
Yeah, so when we talk through like what makes a good or attractive bid, yeah, I think it's very important to highlight like the key parameters, like in terms of the financial bid parameters, are the annuity cap and the net revenue threshold. Yeah, because that will ultimately determine how much or what the risk of the scheme financial vehicle is to support the projects, and what benefit and cost it can occur. So then, like, I think then in order of priority, yeah, all that's being equal, it's the shorter contract term, because that also reduces risk. And then it may be the contracted percentage. Yeah. So if you say, if you have a project and you bid like a contracted percentage of 50%, but your AC is double than what it would be for the whole project, yeah, that's not a benefit. Yeah, in that regard. So it's linked to that. But if you think like your project makes like you only need it for part of the project, because for the other part you may have a tolling agreement, yeah, then that could be efficient for the consumer. The reason why we've introduced the contracted percentage in the first place is that we want to encourage projects above like what the expected tender size is to participate. Yeah. So, but like per se, like the contracted percentage only comes into play like if all other key bid parameters are kind of on the same level.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Thanks, Timo. Nadia, a question for you. Some of the merit criteria relate to community impacts. What if a demand response project has no new infrastructure and no community impacts? How do we respond to this?
Thanks, Deb. And so in relation to this, we do recognise the particular scenario where a demand response project does not relate to any new build. That has been contemplated also in the tender guidelines, and I do encourage proponents to look at section 4 of the tender guidelines, where we provide some more guidance in terms of what is required and what's not required. But as Gina just mentioned earlier, just to reiterate, in those scenarios, bidders are not required to provide a community engagement plan. But that said, were proponents to opt to strengthen their bid, you can provide some additional information on other opportunities or other initiatives that you might be supporting as an organisation in relation to the communities in which you operate, and that will be assessed favourably, although it is not a requirement. So it is a way to strengthen your bid, but you will not be penalised for not, and you're not required to submit that returnable schedule.
Terrific. Thanks, Nadia. Ernie, question for you. Does the consumer trustee have a preference for a certain duration?
Thanks, Deb. So the minimum duration we're looking for is approximately 2 hours. If we're looking at 2 bids, all else equal, one bid has a longer duration, then the value of that longer duration for that bid will be looked at as part of MC1 through the unserved energy that James spoke about. However, we don't have a preference for duration, but just giving that example as an all else equal.
Thank you. Question for James. What could lead to increases in the indicative tender size? When will proponents be told of this?
Thanks, Deb. So as Timo alluded to earlier, the AEMC is reviewing the interim reliability standard at the moment, and their draft report said that they would like to extend it out to 2028. If they make that as their final recommendation and that is adopted by the New South Wales government in regulations, then it would apply. Depending the timing on that, we would then increase the tender size to adjust the reliability standard that has been moved in the modelling that we undertook for this firm tender. In terms of being aware, all registered participants who will be told through our online portal, and so we do encourage everyone to register for the tender so you get all the updates through there.
Great, thank you. Question for Ernie, and it's a question in 2 parts. Firstly, could you please confirm what the eligibility criteria are and where we can see a list of these eligibility criteria? And secondly, I note that you mentioned that the eligibility criteria 1 SEARs received and 2 preliminary connection inquiry submitted. Is this likely to be sufficient for the merit criteria as well?
Thanks, Deb. So there are proponent and project eligibility criteria, and they are outlined in the tender guidelines. Please refer to the tender guidelines. So eligibility criteria is what the project and proponent need to establish to be eligible for the tender. Merit assessment will then be undertaken on the merit criteria, which assesses, how the project will score from a merit perspective. On MC4, which is the one that's most relevant for the stage of development, the key merit assessment will look at the ability and credibility of the pathway to reach commercial operations date by 1st of December 2025. And so that will be the merit assessment. Please refer to the tender guidelines for more detail around that.
Terrific, thank you. Question for James, where can I see the boundaries of the regions?
So in terms of how Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong is defined, the Energy Security Target Monitor, which is AEMO, have provided some definition of that in their report. We have also provided the guidelines of the 500 kV lines around Sydney that we are using as the boundary for Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong sub-region in an addendum to our market briefing, and that's available on our website. Additional to that, we are looking to do some additional work around how we define them for demand response projects, because they all relate to transmission lines. And so we'll be looking as to that process when we finalise the contracts in the coming month.
Terrific. Thank you for that. And let's go to another one here. Nadia, the guidelines mention that the supply chain inputs and investment in an innovation in the supply chain criteria only apply to battery storage projects. Could you confirm this and provide reasoning as to why this is the case?
So, in short, the regional economic development commitments apply to all new infrastructure projects, so all projects that relate to procurement of new infrastructure. The guidelines does not provide baseline targets for all technologies, but that is not to say that all technologies are not to respond to it. So basically everyone has to provide their responses, and they have to tailor their responses that is appropriate for their technology and describe the particular supply chain opportunities and how they've assessed that for their relevant technologies and how that applies to their project. And that will be assessed on a competitive basis.
Terrific. Thanks very much. Timo, are projects with earlier commercial operations dates viewed more favourably? Would this be picked up in merit criteria 1 or other merit criteria?
So in terms of the commercial operations date, I think that may be useful for everybody. Like when you provide your project bid, you have to commit to that COD. Yeah. So the moment you submit your project bid, that COD is logged in, and there's no opportunity to change it then in the financial value bid stage. Yeah. So it needs to be substantiated by evidence that you will achieve it. Yeah. And we are going as part of merit criteria 4, we're going to look at that evidence and make an assessment based on that. Yeah. All else be and the other point where like the commercial operations date plays into is the is MC1, maybe MC1, the financial value assessment. Yeah. So all else being equal, a project that maybe comes like a couple of months earlier prior to the 1st of December 2025 may be seen favorably. Yeah, but it's not so we're not assessing based on the COD that you provide us. Like, sure, we do that, but also we predominantly, or first and foremost, we look at the evidence as well. Yeah, and then we make a risk-based assessment.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Nadia, I'm going to come back to you. Local steel is in short supply, and we're having will have a significant impact on the bid prices. Can we submit commitments that are lower than the targets?
So as we have also described in the guidelines, the commitments, so we require proponents to assess opportunities to make commitments to local supply, and where there are challenges, for example, as in this example in local steel, we will assess the level of commitment that you can provide in the context of the evidence that you provide in terms of what is available and what analysis you have undertaken to understand the opportunities for local supply and hence justifying the commitments that you have provided, and that will form part of the assessment. So you can submit something that is below the target, but we do require justification as to why, and the more detailed and the more considered that evidence is, that will weigh into your assessment.
Terrific, thank you. I'm going to go back to you, Ernie. Is a new electrolyser project eligible?
Thanks, Deb. So there are no eligibility criteria tied to specific technologies. So subject to the project and the proponent meeting the eligibility criteria and being able to meet the terms of the Alteso agreement, they would be eligible.
Terrific, thank you. Gina, question for you. How much detail is required in a community engagement plan? A battery project hasn't typically done a lot of these, and we'd like some guidance on how this might be required.
So the community engagement plan formally is a returnable schedule that is an Excel document that requires quantitative inputs around community targets. That's available online, so you can get an example of what we'll be asking. There will also be additional questions in the project bid form under the merit criteria 6. And that simply seeks to understand a proponent's own understanding of their community impacts and the stakeholders in their region and how they intend to offset any impact that they may have, or how they've taken into account the feedback received from their community consultations and communications.
Terrific, thank you. Thanks, Gina. Ernie, another question for you. If the capacity is increased because of a change to reliability standard, would that be released under a new tender, or would only parties who tendered for the stage 1 project bid stage be eligible to participate?
Thanks, Deb. So if we look to increase this tender, we will seek to bid an increase to this tender rather than a subsequent tender. We will look to provide information to people as soon as possible on this, but we do think it's it is an opportunity for people to recognise that this might occur. But we will provide some more information as soon as we can.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Any Timo, question for you. Can you please comment on if there is a requirement to operate the asset as a standalone project rather than as part of a portfolio of assets?
So there's a requirement in the firming LTESA, and the overarching requirement there is to minimize the annuity payment from the SFE. So it is a requirement to operate it as a standalone asset, but if you can reduce your annuity payment through portfolio optimization, then that would be favorable, or not favorable, but that would be acceptable.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks
But
for that.
sorry,
Oh,
one
yeah,
more point,
please.
but we would need to look into the specifics of that.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Let me just keep on working through to see if there's any other questions that we haven't been able to get to. Let's go back. Ernie, there was another sort of follow-up question for you on the electrolyser. Thanks for the comments on the electrolyser eligibility. Are you expecting bids from hydrogen electrolysers? So any, and I hope I'm saying that correctly too.
No,
yeah.
You are.
Oh, good.
Look, as I said, from an eligibility perspective, different technologies are all eligible. Difficult for me to comment on what we're expecting in terms of projects into this tender.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I think we've gotten through most of the questions there that we've been able to answer in this webinar. If you do have any final questions, please just pop them into the Q&A, and I'll see if I can get to those in just a moment. But just like to remind people that we are going to put a copy of this recording onto the AEMO services website following today's session, and we're also going to provide a summary of the questions that were asked and answered in the session as well, so that everybody who was able to join today and not able to join for the full duration of today can have access to all of that information as well. So I think that we may have been able to get through all of those questions. Any questions that I might have accidentally missed on the way through, we will capture in terms of that grouping of materials at the end of the session as well. Can I then hand over now to Marguerite to just provide a little bit more detail about next steps. Thanks, Marguerite.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks everyone on the commercial team. So as Deb noted, we'll be making a recording available on the website in the coming days, and also responding to any outstanding questions. If you do want to meet with us regarding your project, that is available. So please do email us at stakeholderengagement@aemoservices.com.au, and we'll set up a mutually suitable time. The team did go through a lot today, a lot taken from the tender guidelines, which are also available on the website as part of the tender pack. So, make sure you subscribe to the email list.
Terrific. Thanks, Marguerite. And I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of our presenters today. Thank you for all the effort that's gone into preparing for today's session, and those people behind the scenes in the AEMO services team also do a lot of work to get these sessions up. And thank you to those that have come along today. We've really enjoyed your company and the really terrific questions as well. So we hope you have a really fantastic afternoon, and See you later on. Thank you.